Story time about how two men tried to kidnap me after work. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. I just turned 19 years old and I've been working at a coffee shop for 6 months. Unfortunately, sometimes I have to close the coffee shop all by myself, but it didn't really ever bother me until now. My parents, on the other hand, really don't like for me to close the coffee shop by myself, which of course makes total sense. At first I thought they were just overreacting, but they weren't. My parents would usually pick me up after my closing shift, but they would always arrive 15 minutes before I actually had to lock up just to make sure that I got out safely. 2 weeks ago, my dad had to go on a business trip, so my mom was the one that was going to have to go pick me up by herself. A few hours before closing time, my mom texted me saying that unfortunately the car wasn't turning on. She told me that she would call AAA, but I told her not to worry and that I would just get an Uber home. She kept fighting me on it, but I managed to convince her to just stay home. I kept my mom in the loop the entire night about the closing shift, and finally I called my Uber. The Uber was 10 minutes away, so I just waited inside until I saw them pull up. As I was gathering my things and putting on a jacket, I hear a knock at the door. When I turn around to look, it's a guy in a suit. He begs for me to let him in so that he could get a coffee. I apologized and said that we were closed for the night but that he could come back in the morning. Then he started begging more and more. I actually felt really bad for him because he looked like he was freezing, so I decided to open the door and let him in quickly. He ordered an espresso and I quickly made it. I handed it to him, he paid really quickly and told me he was on his way out. Suddenly, another guy walks in through the door because I forgot to lock it behind me. And when the other guy walks in, the first guy told him to go straight to the cash register. Instantly, I knew that I was being robbed. But the guy with the suit was definitely the mastermind behind everything. He told me to sit down and that as long as I didn't do anything, he wouldn't hurt me. But I remembered I had the Uber still on the way. But it's not like I could pull out my phone to check if it was near. There was a panic button underneath the counter under the register, but I was sitting 2 tables away from it. Suddenly, I feel something in the back of my neck. The guy that had just been at the cash register comes up behind me and starts blowing on my neck. He started saying how pretty I was and that I looked way better in person than in picture. The guy in the suit chuckled and said, yeah, she is pretty in person. Suddenly, he grabs me by my arm and tells me that I'm leaving with them. I begged and begged for them not to. That's when I remembered my dad gave me a tip in case someone was ever trying to pick me up. I threw myself to the ground and acted as dead weight. It made it really hard for the one guy to pick me up. Luckily, I could reach over and hold onto a pole that was right near the register, and I held onto it as tight as I could. We struggled for about 30 seconds. Suddenly, the other guy comes in front of me, bites my hands down so that I could let go of the pole. Instead, I kept holding on tight. Out of nowhere, my phone starts to ring and I realize it's probably the Uber driver. I told the guys that my Uber driver was waiting for me outside and that they would get caught. The Uber driver must have seen what was happening inside because he started beeping really loud. The guy in the suit puts me in a chokehold and I begin to pass out. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how two men tried to kidnap me after work. Disclaimer, is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. The man in the suit had me in a chokehold, but I could hear the Uber driver beeping as loud as he could outside. He had already seen what was happening to me and probably already called the cops. The man in the suit dragged my body towards the back exit. His partner had already left. This is when I saw my opportunity. I knew where all the pans and pots and knives were. I reached for a pot and I hit him as hard as I could. But unlike how it happens in the movies, he did not pass out. Instead, this made him angrier, but it gave me a second to run towards the front of the store. As soon as I did that, I could hear the police sirens pulling up toward the front of the store. This made the man in the suit back away from me. I ran to the cops and I was safe. Unfortunately, the 2 men haven't been found. And I was interrogated for hours. My dad came home from the trip, but now I'm terrified that these guys know where I live. Also, what picture was he talking about? The police think that they had been stalking me for weeks, if not months. I'm terrified and I don't know what to do. Help me. Story time about how I stole my best friend's boyfriend and she ended up poisoning me. Disclaimer, is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. I met my ex-best friend 10 years ago. We hit it off right away in school and were inseparable. But shortly into our friendship, I noticed how jealous and envious she was. She envied my life and everything that I had. I got lots of attention from boys and she didn't. Every time we would go out, I was the one constantly getting hit on. It actually made me feel so bad for her. I stopped dressing up whenever we would hang out, and I even stopped wearing makeup just to make her feel better. She asked me if I was doing that on purpose and I told her no. I told her I just wanted to feel more natural and that it had nothing to do with her. But this actually started working. That's when she started borrowing my clothes and my makeup. She didn't even know how to use makeup, so I would do it for her. Every single weekend that we would go out, she would look really amazing. I would do her makeup and her hair and dress her up before we went out. Usually I would go in jeans and a t-shirt and not do anything to my hair or my face. But like I said, I only did this when I would go out with her. Whenever I went out with other friends, I would always look my best. But it actually started to work. Instead of me getting hit on at the bars and clubs, she would get hit on. And this made her feel so much better. And it actually made me really happy too. She started going on a few dates, and she had really good guys interested in her. One of the guys was in financing, owned a house, and traveled a lot, and was good looking too. The other one owned his own business, was good looking, really tall, and wanted kids right away. He would basically tell her that he wanted to marry her, but instead of being interested in them, she wanted to date more guys. She became a serial dater. Before I knew it, every single weekend I would go to her house to help her get ready for her dates, which by the way would take me 2 to 3 hours to do her hair, makeup, and outfit. But like I said, I was happy to help her. On one occasion, I told her I couldn't come over to do her makeup and her hair because I had a date of my own. She told me I was ungrateful and hung up the phone on me. I was shocked by her behavior. While I was on my date, she called me 10 times. When I answered, she demanded to know where I was. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how I stole my best friend's boyfriend and she ended up poisoning me. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, send me on Instagram. After I see her 10 missed calls while I was on my date, I finally call her back. And when I answered, all she asked me was where I was. I told her I was on my date and that I couldn't talk. That's when she told me that she would just bring the makeup to where I was so that I could help her do her makeup for her date. I was so angry that I decided to defend myself. I told her she was being a brat and super ungrateful. Then I told her I was gonna hang up on her and not talk to her for the next few days. I decided to turn off my phone for the rest of the night. Finally, a few days later, I decided to call her. That's when she gives me a half-ass apology telling me she shouldn't have done that and that she was acting like a brat. That's when I told her I didn't want to do her makeup and hair every single weekend. She said she would learn how to do her own makeup if I could just teach her. So of course, I agreed. After that, things got way better between us. She actually ended up becoming girlfriend with one of the guys, the one that was the business owner. She insisted that we do a double date. So I ended up having a date come with me to dinner with them. We were having fun up until my best friend started getting really drunk. This is when she just started acting out. She started telling the guys about how much I would get hit on and about all the dates I've been on, about how many sexy time partners I had. I mean, this is girl code. You do not talk about exes or guys that your girlfriend is dating to her boyfriend or date. I was so angry with her. Her boyfriend looked at me, apologized, and said that he would take her home. So my date and I decided to stay at the restaurant and finish our dinner. Then I get a message from my best friend's boyfriend apologizing on her behalf. He asked me if he could call me on the phone and we talked for an hour. Part 2 is up. Part 3 of how I stole my best friend's boyfriend and she ended up poisoning me. Disclaimer, is not my story time, send me on Instagram. My BF's boyfriend called me. He apologized for my best friend's behavior while she was drunk. I told him that I would talk to her whenever she was sober. Before I knew it, he and I had been on the phone for a full hour. He was making me laugh so much and we were having such a great conversation. We finally got off the phone and I literally had butterflies in my stomach. And I started thinking about him differently. I mean, I knew that he was my best friend's boyfriend, but he was being so nice. And he was successful and funny and good looking. That's when I decided to cut my best friend off. I stopped answering her texts and phone calls. One day she showed up at my house asking me if I could help her get ready for another date. I told her that I didn't want to be her friend anymore and basically slammed the door in her face. She kept calling me to apologize and eventually I accepted. But her boyfriend and I didn't stop texting. I started to realize that I was falling for him, so I decided to tell him that I had feelings and that we shouldn't talk anymore. That's when he told me that he had feelings for me too. All this while, I would still hang out with my best friend every single weekend. She would bring me food and make us drinks while she was at my place. I started feeling different symptoms after a few weeks. I would get these really bad headaches and I just felt sick all the time. I decided to go to the doctor and they couldn't find anything. One day her boyfriend calls me and tells me that he really wants to see me. He comes over to my house and we kissed. He told me that he wanted to break up with her to be with me. I couldn't resist and I said yes. When we confronted her, she said that she had seen our messages already. She called me a bunch of names and told me that she had been poisoning me. First I didn't believe her, but then I went and got tested and it was true. I haven't spoken to her since and I don't know if I should tell the cops. Him and I are still together. What should I do?
I, 30 female, helped my ex's 35 male new girlfriend, 19 female, end her pregnancy and have now taken her in. And I'm getting a lot of backlash from his community. First, I would like to say I have no jealousy or contempt for this girl, and she is a girl to me, a child. My ex did cheat on me with her, but she was not aware at that time. I extricated myself from the situation when she was made aware, with only a single message over Insta to her that cheaters don't change. If he did it to me, he'll do it to you. Let me know if you ever need to talk. I sent that message last September. This January, I received a message that said, I don't have anyone. He's the worst. Are you available? She came to me. She was pregnant. She stayed in the basement suite of my home, and 2 weeks later, I helped her to end the pregnancy and since encouraged her to start therapy. She is not on speaking terms with her family at all. We got along well enough that I wrote up a single tenancy and she'd be staying for $500 a month since. I am child-free, but I'm very strongly fond of her, in an oddly maternal way. I introduced her to my family. She's of a similar age to my youngest sister and they get along well. Recently, I've helped her apply to colleges. The issue starts that recently the ex found out she aborted the pregnancy. Apparently, she told one of my sister's friends, who is the sibling of my ex's closest friend. He has since been harassing me on all socials, calling me all the grotesque things you can think of, creating new socials to do this also. His mother called me to harass me for ending her grandchild because I'm a heartless woman who hates children, because I'm child-free. And that just because I want to be useless, a child-free woman, doesn't mean I need to destroy my ex's line. It's affecting my work also because recently my amazing boss retired and was replaced by a sniveling asshole who is extremely conservative and has seen the social media posts and has brought it up to me on lunch breaks. I wouldn't be surprised if he attempts to let me go in a sideways way for it. If he tries to do that, that is 1000% a lawsuit. I've also noticed a few of my friends have pulled away, thinking I'm helping her out of spite and asking me why I got involved. I'm just tired. I'm not legally adept for my age, in all honesty, and I've been under a lot of stress and been struggling with my own mental health, and this is just a lot right now. I just need some advice going forward. How do I broach this topic with friends without saying much? How do I deal with my boss? HR is shit. I'm just lost and tired. And at the moment, I'm glad it's mostly directed at me because apparently he hasn't contacted her, and I'm worried about him contacting her since she's finally doing well.
I've been married to my wife for 2 years. Before we moved into our own house, we used to stay with my parents. My father has a big house and I'm their only child. My mom advised me to move into the house with my wife in order to save us the cost of renting a place. My wife didn't like the idea, but I was able to convince her to move into my parents' house with me in order for us to get our privacy. We moved to the other side of the house. Everything was great at first till my wife started complaining about my mother. She said my mom has no boundaries and that she enters into our room without knocking. She has told my mother to please knock before entering into our room several times, but she doesn't listen. She once entered into our room without knocking and found my wife naked. Instead of her to just leave the room and give my wife some privacy, she told my wife everything she came to tell her before she left. When I came home that day, tears were streaming down my wife's face when she told me what my mom had done. I went to talk to my mom right away and she said they were both women, so she didn't see anything wrong with talking to my wife while she was naked. I told her to start knocking before she enters into our room. She finally agreed to knock, but then she started giving my wife the silent treatment. I had to talk to her again about this before she stopped. My wife started cooking for the whole house when we moved into my parents' house, but my mother will constantly complain about my wife's food, even though the food is always very nice and tasty. It got so bad to the extent that my mom started going into the kitchen when my wife was cooking to teach her how to cook. Every day there was one issue after the other. My wife is an introvert. She's very timid and she doesn't like confrontations, so I knew it was my mom causing the issues. It got so bad that my wife wanted us to move out, so we did. My mom didn't like the idea and tried to convince us to stay, but it was too late. My wife didn't want us to stay close to my parents at all, so we moved to a new city entirely. All this happened last year. Now my wife is pregnant and she's in her third trimester. She will be giving birth soon. Her mom is dead and she has no sisters. Since this is our first child, she has no experience at all in taking care of the baby. I'm also a very busy man. My mom had told us earlier when she found out my wife was pregnant that she would like to come and help once the baby arrives. The thing is, my wife doesn't want her around. She says she'll do everything by herself, and I know taking care of a baby is very stressful, especially since she has no experience at all. My mom is also very eager to help her, but no matter what I say, my wife refuses to let my mother come. She said my mother is only going to add to her stress and make things complicated for her. Since there was nothing I could say to convince my wife, I called my mom and told her my wife has decided to do everything by herself. She doesn't need any help. My mom broke into tears on the phone and said she deserves to take care of her grandson. She still wants to come and she says she's going to be there whether my wife likes it or not. I told her my wife is the mother and that it is up to her to make the decisions. So if she doesn't want my mom around, then I have to respect her wishes. She got angry and cut the line. She has refused to speak to me since. At the end of the day, she's my mom. I love her and I don't want her to be mad at me, but I also don't want to do something my wife is not okay with. I'm conflicted and I don't know what to do. Any advice on what to do will be very much appreciated. This follower needs your advice, babes. Please drop some below. Follow me or click the plus sign for more story times.
Am I the arsehole for calling my daughter's dad spineless and his girlfriend creepy after what they decided to call their daughter? Story time. So, a little bit of context. I ended up falling pregnant with my daughter on a drunken hookup. I know it's not very glamorous, but that's the truth of it all. When we found out that I was pregnant, we decided that we would keep the baby and we would co-parent as friends. We were never a couple, nor did we want to be. 4 years ago, Steve met a girl called Amy and they ended up moving in together this time last year. She fell pregnant very quick and I've been extremely supportive where I can be. I've had a big chat with my daughter about it. I've told her that she needs to help out wherever necessary and to behave while she's there so that she's not making their life any more stressful. I also mentioned that I'd love our children to have a really close relationship despite having different mothers. I'm actually really happy that my daughter is getting a sibling because I didn't want any more children, so this kind of works out for the best. So 3 days ago, Amy gave birth and Steve texted me asking if I could bring our daughter to meet her. So of course I did exactly that. But then they introduced us to the baby. I was shocked. The name they used was my daughter's name. I'm done, I'm out. So Amy, the mum, didn't seem to have any sort of issue. She didn't think to let me know. We didn't have a conversation about it. But Steve, the dad, seemed very, very uncomfortable and he wouldn't even look me in the eye. So I was like, What are we playing at here? What's going on? At that point, Steve's dad was like, I'll take your daughter out. We'll go to the cafe. He was like, peace out, tap it out. Steve told me to not overreact about the situation and to calm down. While Amy, with the audacity, turned around and said, I don't really see what the problem is. It was just a pretty name that we liked. Original. And I was trying to work out if they'd named the child after my daughter. And Amy was like, nah, it was just a pretty name that we both really liked. Well, no shit, you really liked. You've already got a daughter named that, weirdo. And I was really trying to wrap my brain around this. So I was like, great, so what are we going to use as like her nickname? Like, is she going to go by her middle name? Like, what's going on? I very quickly just came to the realisation that this was the name and they didn't see anything wrong with it at all. This is the most mad Steve and Amy have ever moved. I'm calling it right now. And that was when I turned to Amy. I was like, you're a creep. Steve tried to interject and like break it up. And I was like, you can't get involved. You are a spineless man. He then tried to tell me that our daughter could go by a nickname instead. Amy then called me a bitch and then asked the nurses to remove me. I got kicked out of the hospital. So what do you think here? Am I the arsehole?